A detachment of military topographers, who accidentally stumbled upon the Lykovs' hut in 1946, stayed with them for 2 days and headed back. Safely descended to Lake Teletskoye at the mouth of the Koksha River and arrived by water in the village of Yaylyu. Here the officer spoke in detail about the Lykovs, about his help to the detachment, and drew attention to the extremely difficult situation of the family. The officer's report about the meeting with the Lykovs was received with surprise in our village. The fact is that everyone was sure that the Lykovs, after meeting in 1941 with a detachment of border guards and NKVD officers, went down the river to the village of Tishi. In any case, this was what Molokov advised then, and Lykov agreed with this proposal. Talking about the Lykovs in our village, the officer said that no matter what the conversation was going on, Karp Osipovich never objected, did not contradict, and the officer explained this behavior by the fact that Lykov, apparently, was afraid to object or express disagreement, so as not to anger the interlocutor, and agreed with everything that was said, although there was an obvious insincerity. I drew attention to extreme poverty, misery, to the fact that although they somehow communicated, the tension was constant, either from the overwhelming fear that gripped them, or from the fact that they were so wild that they could step over this line, calm down and believe they were unable to do good. In any case, such an impression was created. Therefore, the officer did everything possible to somehow convince them to calm down, overcome themselves and think that it is impossible to live like this all the time, that you need to think about your children and yourself. This was an official message, so the management of the reserve notified the district party committee of everything and reported to the regional authorities. The director of the reserve, Martinov, was summoned to the regional party committee, where he was given the appropriate suggestion that a family of old believers was hiding on the territory of the reserve entrusted to him, thus violating a number of state laws. In addition, Lykov was accused of hiding in the taiga. He shirked from military service and did not take part in the defense of the motherland during the war years, and the management of the reserve should not contribute to this. After discussing this issue, it was proposed to send a detachment of observers with representatives of the NKVD in order to bring the Lykov family out to the people, arrange it, and bring the head of the family Karp Osipovich to justice. Meanwhile, winter had come. The question of the fate of the Lykovs was returned more than once. Various options were discussed. The management of the reserve suggested relocating the Lykovs to the Balkan cordon, where before the war he agreed to move, register him as an observer of the reserve and thus leave him alone and provide his family with all kinds of help and support. Representatives of the authorities had a different opinion. They talked about bringing the head of the family to responsibility for shirking from service in wartime. There were suggestions not to touch him at all, let him live where he wants and how he wants. In short, they began to prepare for the campaign to Lykov almost immediately, as soon as they received information about his whereabouts. At first it was decided to visit the Lykovs in the same autumn, but there were plenty of problems besides the Lykovs, and it was simply impossible to immediately focus on the Lykovs. Time passed, and winter was approaching, so we settled on the option of the first proposal, to send a detachment of observers in February next, 1947. Everyone was sure that the Lykovs would not go anywhere until spring. At the end of September, food was brought to the Balkan cordon by pack route and, as in the pre-war years, was hidden in a cache. Considering that the hike in winter will take many days and carry food, personal items and weapons will be difficult, so the imported food will solve this problem. It was planned to approach the cordon in the second half of the campaign. Shortly before the meeting, it was decided, as previously planned, to follow the shortest route, from the Kijin Bay, which is in the southernmost part of Lake Teletskoye, through the Abakan Ridge, and try to go down to the Abakan River by the valley of its tributary, the Aranat River. This way, more precisely the valley of the Aranat River, no one has ever passed either in winter or in summer. This is a deep gorge, and if people were in the upper reaches of the Aranat and in the lower reaches, then the valley in the middle reaches was a blank spot. This was alarming. But Molokov insisted to go through the valley of Aranat, and if the gorge turns out to be impassable, then go to the left slope, traverse it and go down into the valley of Abakan below the confluence of the Aranat. From this side, Lykov could not wait for anyone. At the meeting, the NKVD representative said that only observers would go, since Lykov poses no social danger and their presence is not necessary. The detachment was formed of 6 people, headed by the head of the reserves guard, Ivan Bushev. The detachment included a relative of the Lykovs, Roman Kazanin, and Molokov, already known to us. 3 young observers, Pavel Anuchakov, Lenty Zasarin, and the author of these lines completed the composition of the detachment. And although, of course, Bushev was officially appointed the head of the campaign, in fact, Molokov was in charge of all actions and made the final decisions. Everyone obeyed him unquestioningly. His authority was indisputable. A little retreating, it must be said that shortly after returning from the campaign to Lykov in the fall of 1941, which I already wrote about, Molokov went to the front and ended the war in Berlin in 1945 safe and sound, except that during the enemy shelling a splinter completely tore off the middle finger of his right hand at the very base. Both of his sons, Perfily and Mikhail, died at the front. Immediately after the death of both sons, a funeral came to Daniel Makarovich himself, and a few days after that the bear attacked livestock, and both of their cows, fleeing, fell off the steep slope of the mountain and crashed. The day after the death of the cows, for some unknown reason, the only pig died. All this at once fell upon a lonely woman living at the time on the cordon of the Karatash Reserve. Molokov's wife Domna Vasilievna found the strength and courageously endured such a terrible coincidence of tragic events, although, as she later said, she prayed to God to take her too. But a month later, to great joy, a letter came from Molokov himself from the field hospital, where he was healing the wound. Returning from the front, Danila Makarovich immediately came to the management of the reserve, and he was reinstated as a senior observer. A huge territory of the reserve was given under his control. A remarkable person, Vyacheslav Andreevich Ilichevsky, who worked for several years as the head of security in the pre-war years, died in the war. Of the 4 researchers of the reserve who went to the front, only one, Fyodor Dmitrievich Shaposhnikov, returned. His brother Yevgeny Dmitrievich, Arkady Vladimirovich Mankovsky, and Mikhail Alexandrovich Martinenko died in the war. They all left good memories of themselves. They were well educated, highly cultured and sociable people. They did a lot for the cultural life of our taiga village. Researchers welcomed the hiring of Lykov as an observer at the Abakan cordon, considering him a great connoisseur of the most remote and little studied area, the upper reaches of the Bolshoy Abakan River. They said that Lykov is a storehouse of knowledge of the nature of the Western Sayan Mountains. In the first post-war years, the situation with good equipment was very bad, so everyone's equipment left much to be desired. All on yourself. Wadded trousers, wadded quilted jackets, over which canvas jackets, on the legs of Ichigi, and that's all, no tents, sleeping bags, although they had to spend about 15-17 days in the winter taiga, sleeping by the fire. We went on a hike from the Chiri cordon, which is in the Kitchen Bay. The first day of the hike, we walked along the bottom of the valley of the Kiga River and stopped for the night at the foot of Mount Karp, from where a steep ascent began almost to the Abakan Ridge. We approached the upper border of the forest on the Abakan Ridge on the 3rd day around lunchtime and stopped for the night. The next few days, with great difficulty, we passed the pass and went down the dangerous canyon of the Aranat River. This was the first and only passage through the Aranat Valley. Molokov said that he had never heard from anyone that someone had ever passed this way. And he knew the upper reaches of the Bolshoy and Malya Abakan since the mid-20s. I can also say with confidence that, from the 40s to the present day, no one has been there. Talking with local hunters on a hot spring, I asked about Aranat, and everyone always said that there was no move there. And when I once said that we walked along Aranat in winter, one hunter replied, "Do not gaps, how difficult it carried you there, tired of living." The Lykovs hut was seen almost immediately, as soon as they passed this gap. She was about 600 meters from us. Having carefully examined the area around us through binoculars, we did not see any traces in the snow confirming the presence of a person. The hut was on a low counter by the river, surrounded on 3 sides by a young birch grove. Despite the absence of traces of a person, they approached with caution. We understood perfectly well that neither Lykov himself nor members of his family posed any danger, but no one knew whether they were alone in these places. They only knew that there could be those who were hiding in the mountains for various reasons, for whom meeting people from the world would be undesirable. And if no one could even suspect of our existence when we were in the Ernat Gorge, now we somehow found ourselves. The place is quite open, and we could be seen against the background of snow from any slope of the valley. We understood this, so we were ready for anything. It was the second post-war year, when talk about deserters hiding in the taiga had not yet died out, and we had to be extremely attentive. It must be said that all sorts of instructions on how to act in a given situation boiled down to convincing Lykov to leave and either go to serve in the protection of the reserve, or, in case of refusal, to offer him to leave the reserve with the onset of spring. We did not find the Lykovs here, and, apparently, they left this place inhabited by them even before the onset of winter. It was a complete surprise for us. Even Molokov, who knew the Lykovs very well, was surprised and, with his characteristic humor, laughing, said, "Here is a bitch, got his pants dirty, as I saw the military." Apparently, Lykov, having weighed all the pros and cons, came to the conclusion that there is only one thing to save him and his family, to leave without leaving a trace. We stopped here for the night and carefully examined the estate. It consisted of a small hut about X meters, soundly cut down, covered with chopped cedar blocks with a Russian adobe stove. Small window about 10 by 15 centimeters without glass. Glass, as the most expensive thing, was transferred for installation from one place of residence to another. The tight-fitting door was secured by elaborate wooden hinges, and there was not a single nail, not a single piece of iron, only wood. There was nothing of the furniture, except for a wide couch, table and bench. The hut is warm, the planed floor is also made of thick cedar blocks. Several spindles were stuck behind the uterus, under the ceiling. Of the outbuildings, there was a rather spacious canopy of cedar blocks, under which we found shoes of various sizes in the form of cheap, worn out and unsuitable for wearing. All the shoes were made of well-dressed merle leather. Various household utensils were also kept here. There are a lot of birch bark and blanks for tuske, blanks for cups, spoons and other utensils made of cedar, old skis, a spinning wheel and much more that would otherwise pass for unnecessary rubbish. Everything was neatly arranged. On several shelves in birch bark boxes were a little bit of rye and barley seeds and a box with the remains of dried berries. About 10 meters from the hut, on 2 cedar stumps with hewn bark at a height of about 2 meters, a small barn storage was built, in which there were some tar black dry cakes, some dried vegetables, berries, pine nuts and hemp seeds. Examining the Lykovs estate, everyone wondered how it was possible to live in such conditions, having nothing but what they could get in the taiga, in the river and in the garden. No communication with the world for many years. Molokov told us that the Lykovs can read and write, which we were surprised at least me, and not only they themselves, but also teach growing children. We spent several days at the Lykovs estate and in its environs, making daily radial exits in different directions, conducting constant observations from dawn until dark, but we never saw any smoke or light anywhere, did not find any, even old traces on snow. It was clear that the Lykovs only stoked the stove at night and, apparently, did not go far from their homes, unless, of course, they were somewhere nearby and went down the Abokin to their old place of residence. Leaving the Lykovs estate, the author of these lines, under general dictation, wrote a letter in flat block letters so that the Lykovs could read without difficulty. In the letter that we left in his hut, we set out the purpose of our parish, said once again that the war was over, that life would now be good, and once again offered to go down Abokin to the cordon and go to serve in the reserve, focusing on their future children. The letter also said who was and how many people, indicating the surnames, names, patronymics of all of us. We fixed the letter on the wall opposite to the door in such a way that under any conditions the Lykovs could see it. The letter also determined the time of meeting with representatives of the reserve at the cordon, where he was invited before the war. It was from June 15 to September 25, that is, the time when the workers of the reserve will be at the cordon without a break. And the fact that the Lykovs would still come here if they stayed somewhere here in the taiga, we had no doubt, since much of what is needed on the farm, especially in such extreme conditions, was neatly tidied up and prepared for carrying. The nature of the upper reaches of the Bolshaya Bakan differs from neighboring places in that the snow cover is somewhat less here, therefore ungulates, in particular merles, gather in these places for wintering, and their tracks were everywhere. And in some places, we met large areas of the snow surface, where there was not a single square meter without traces of these graceful animals. The river in the upper reaches is not completely covered with ice, and non-freezing areas remain throughout the winter. This is confirmed by the fact that we observed diving ducks, gogol, and even one pair of mallards, only about 24 individuals that remained here for the winter, and apparently, it was a small population of resident ducks. Otter tracks were found everywhere. The otters themselves, calmly diving up and running along open areas of water, were seen several times. They were not at all afraid of us. To one of them, sitting on the ice near the water, we decided to come as close as possible. She took care of herself, cleaned her face, in a word, preened herself, and did not pay any attention to us. The two of us, without making any sudden movements, without haste, began to approach and, as is customary in such cases, did not walk directly at her, but as if a little to the side, so as not to arouse her suspicions ahead of time. We managed to approach 10 meters at first, but she did not show any excitement and continued to study herself. And when there were meters to her, she got worried, began to examine us. I had to stop. She calmed down, and we moved towards her, and then she instantly dived into the water, but almost immediately stuck her muzzle out of the water and, apparently not seeing anything threatening, jumped out onto the ice again, continuing to examine us. We didn't come closer. I began to say something to her in a low voice. She slightly tilted her head, wiggled her ears and, after listening a little, silently disappeared into the water. About 10-15 kilometers from Yaylyu, the river was already completely covered with ice and covered with snow. And the lower we went along a Bakan, the deeper the snow cover became. In one place they saw a wolverine running along the shore, which is a rare event even in such remote places. This mysterious animal, which is poorly studied, did not pay any attention to us or did not notice us until we tried to get it. The fact is that animals such as the wolf, lynx, wolverine and bear were among the dangerous predators and in those years, according to the regulation, were subject to shooting all year round, even in the reserve. She ran about 150 meters away from us, and despite the fact that 4 of us were shooting, the wolverine escaped unharmed. Justifying our blunders, we laughed loudly at each other, but she left us safe and sound, as it seems to her, it was written in her own family. Not finding any traces of the Lykovs' presence, we went down the Bakan, as envisaged by the plan. We entered the village abandoned in 1935, the Verkhnyaya Kurjik Zamka. Unlike other places of residence abandoned by the old believers, in the village of Kairosu, all 6 houses have survived intact. But even here we did not find any traces of human presence. We also visited the counter where the Lykovs lived before leaving for Aranat, and there is no one here and no trace. Thus, we did not find the Lykovs anywhere. Apparently, they went down the Bakan to some village to the people, so anyway, we thought. We were running out of food, and fatigue was felt more and more every day. The places along the Bakan Valley are everywhere quite difficult for skiing, and we got every kilometer with tangible difficulty, especially since we were in difficult conditions for more than 10 days. In addition, we were pretty worn out, our clothes were badly damaged by the fire, and the coals, constantly bouncing off the burning logs, despite being on duty, burned holes in the cotton clothes. At the site of the reserve cordon our joy knew no bounds. Although no one lived here, we were awaited by the products brought in the fall in a warm, spacious house. Observers of the reserve Veniam and Sanarav and myself brought the food on pack horses. We set up a hiding place under the floor in one of the rooms of a semi-detached house. After a 2-day rest in the warmth, we left, now towards the house. 60 kilometers of mountain taiga remained ahead. Having crossed the Bakan Ridge again, we returned to our village on the 17th day from the day we set out on the hike. The results were reported in detail to the management of the reserve, which in turn reported to the higher authorities of the region. We expressed our views that, apparently, we can agree that the Lykovs really went down the Bakan. The administration of the reserve would not have paid so much attention to the Lykovs. It was simply not up to them. However, the documents received from the region, which spoke in a categorical form about the illegality of the Lykovs' residence on the territory and the reserve, were forced to take certain measures. Therefore, it was decided this summer to send a group of observers to Yaylyu and try to clarify whether Lykov went to some village or hid in the taiga, and then decide what to do next. Please share this video on your social networks, using the buttons under the video, and subscribe to the channel. I ask you to go and watch other videos about Agafia Lykova, which you can see now on the screen in the end screensavers. There are a lot of rare and interesting facts about the Hermit. Thank you all for watching.